Okay, so get this right. We asked a bunch of different AIs like Claude, Perplexity, ChatGPT, even Grok and Gemini why Russia invaded Crimea back in 2014. And we fed them all the same set of answers to analyze. But here's the thing. Some of these AIs, they were spot on about the bias in those answers, but others, well, let's just say they didn't quite hit the mark. So today I was going to really break down why that happened. It's way more interesting than it sounds, trust me.
Yeah, it really shows that with AI and bias detection, it isn't a simple good or bad thing. All these different AIs, they've got their own strengths and quirks, and that really affects how they see information, especially something as complex as geopolitical event.
Exactly. So let's dive in with one of the AIs that did great, Claude. It picked up on the fact that some answers used strong language, like invaded and occupied, but other answers used softer terms, like annexation. It seems like a small distance, but
But it actually says a lot about how the information is being framed. Think about it. Invaded makes you think of aggression,
yeah.
right? But annexation sounds more, I don't know, formal, almost legal. Claude was able to see how these little word choices actually hinted at a deeper bias in each set of answers.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. It's like Claude was reading between the lines, catching those little things we humans might completely miss. Now, on the other hand, we had Grok, which seemed to have a harder time. It actually thought one set of answers, the ones with that really strong language, might even be pro-Russian. I don't get it. What happened there?
Well, Grok kind of does a more basic analysis. It seems to focus on keywords without really getting the context they're used in.
Hmm.
So maybe it saw words like military action or strategic importance, and it simplified it too much, missing the bigger picture of how those terms were framing the whole narrative.
Ah, okay. So it's not enough for an AI to just see words. It needs to understand how they're being used to tell a story, to shape a perspective.
Exactly. And that's important for us too, right? Think about anything you read or watch. What language are they using? What are they emphasizing? And what are they leaving out?
Okay, so we've talked about how the words themselves can show bias. But ChatGPT, which also did really well, noticed something else, totally different viewpoints. It figured out that one set of answers aligned more with a Western perspective, which is usually critical of what Russia did, while the other set was closer to Russia's official story.
ChatGPT is really good at analyzing information comparatively.
Yeah.
It doesn't just look at individual statements on their own, it compares them to each other. It looks for patterns and differences that show those hidden biases.
So it was like ChatGPT was playing detective, putting the two sets of answers side by side and seeing they were coming from totally different angles.
Exactly. It saw that one perspective focused on the negative impacts of the invasion, like breaking international law, people being displaced from their homes, all that. But the other perspective focused on historical ties and Russia's security concerns, almost justifying the annexation.
And that's huge, right? Because seeing these different perspectives is key to understanding how information can be used to push an agenda.
Absolutely. It shows why it's so important to know your own biases and how they might affect how you interpret things. We can't just blindly trust any one source of information, even if it seems like it's coming from an objective AI.
All right, so we've got Claude looking at the word choices, ChatGPT comparing the different viewpoints, three very different AIs, each with their own way of finding bias. Up next, we've got Perplexity, Gemini, and DeepSeek. And let me tell you, their analyses are just as interesting.
We're going to see how Perplexity could identify bias just by looking at the structure of the arguments themselves, how the information was organized and presented. And then we'll look at why Gemini, even though it's really advanced, got some things mixed up. It'll be fascinating, I promise.
Well, wait.
So Perplexity, right. It really blew us away with how it went beyond just looking at individual words or phrases. It actually looked at how the whole argument was put together, and that's how it figured out the bias.
Wait, hold on. How can the way an argument is structured be biased? I don't quite get that.
Well, think about it. How information is presented, it can kind of subtly change how you see it. Perplexity noticed that one set of answers really focused on the military stuff, like tactics and Russia's goals. But the other set, it was all about the historical ties and cultural reasons. It's all about what they choose to emphasize, what they put first. It's a way of framing the whole thing.
So even if they use neutral language, the fact that they focused on different parts of the situation could still show a bias.
Exactly. Perplexity was able to see that the set of answers that focused on military strategy, it kind of lined up with the view that Russia is inherently aggressive, wanting to expand its territory, which, let's be real, is a pretty common viewpoint, especially in Western media. But the other set, the one focusing on the historical context and cultural connections, it leaned toward a narrative that kind of downplays Russia's aggression. maybe even making it seem like the annexation was, I don't know, justified or something.
Right.
That's pretty subtle. I could see how that could totally slip past you if you weren't really paying attention.
And that's why Perplexity's analysis is so valuable. It's like it's teaching us to look deeper, to pay attention not just to what they're saying, but how they're saying it.
Okay, so we've got Claude zeroing in on the words themselves, ChatGPT comparing the viewpoints, and Perplexity breaking down the structure of the arguments. What about Gemini? Didn't you say it didn't do so well?
Yeah, Gemini is a super advanced model. It can process tons of info and write stuff that sounds like a human wrote it. But this time it seems like it got tripped up by the tone and framing.
So even though it's so smart, it's still messed up. That's actually kind of reassuring in a weird way. It means these AIs aren't perfect, They still have their limits.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it shows that we humans, we still have a really important job to do when it comes to figuring out what's true and what's not. We can't just let AI do all the thinking for us.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, to be fair to Gemini, it was dealing with a pretty complicated situation. This whole geopolitical conflict with a long history and so many different sides to the story. I can see how even a really powerful AI could get confused.
Right. And it all comes back to context. When you're dealing with something as charged as this, you can't just look at words or phrases by themselves. You got to think about the whole historical, political, and cultural background.
Okay, so Gemini might have stumbled a bit, but we've still got one more AI to talk about, DeepSeek. This one, like Claude, Perplexity, and ChatGPT, actually managed to successfully identify the bias in what we gave it. So how did DeepSeek approach it? What did it focus on?
Well, what was interesting about DeepSeek was that it really honed in on how each set of answers emphasized different parts of the whole Crimea situation. Like, it noticed how one set really hammered on the historical and cultural connections between Russia and Crimea, and Russia's claims about needing to protect its interests, all those arguments that are often used to justify the annexation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, DeepSeek was able to see the bigger picture, like understanding how the way information is presented can actually shape how we see those events. It's like that saying there's two sides to every story, right?
Right. And DeepSeek realized that one side was being given more weight, more emphasis, which means there's a bias in how it's presented. It's a great example of how AI can help us understand these subtle ways that stories are built. So we've covered a lot today, from word choice to argument structure, and even comparing totally different viewpoints. It's amazing to see how these AIs are getting so good at breaking down info and finding those hidden biases that we might miss.
It is fascinating, isn't it? It really changes how we think about how we take in information.
For sure. But it also brings up some big questions, like, what does this all mean for us? The average person just trying to understand this crazy world of information. We can't all be AI experts, so what can we actually use in our everyday lives?
I think the biggest takeaway is that by understanding how AI finds bias, we can actually become better critical thinkers ourselves. It's like AI is giving us new tools, a new way to see the world.
So instead of thinking AI will replace human judgment, we should see it as a way to make our own abilities better.
To improve our critical thinking, right?
Exactly. And one of the best things we can learn from these AI analyses is to pay attention to those subtle hints in language and presentation. How the information is framed, the words they choose, the order of the ideas, all of that can change how we see and understand what's happening.
It's like AI is giving us a crash course in media literacy, teaching us to be more aware of those techniques that try to change our minds or our understanding of things. Absolutely. And being aware is so important, especially now when we're constantly bombarded with information from everywhere. By learning these critical thinking skills, we can be smarter about what we read and hear, better at filtering out the noise and coming to our own conclusions.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's made me realize that bias isn't always obvious, right in your face. It can be super subtle, almost hidden, like it's built into the way information is presented.
And that's why we always got to be on guard, always question what we're reading and hearing. Ask ourselves, who's giving me this info? What's their perspective? What might they be leaving out?
It's like we're all detectives now, trying to figure out the secrets hidden in the language and structure of everything we see and hear. Before we finish up today, I want to leave you with something to think about. Imagine you're reading a news article about something happening right now. How would those different AIs we talked about today analyze that article? Would they all agree? Or would they find different things, different biases?
That's a great question. It really shows that even with AI getting so advanced, human judgment is still super important. AI can help us see things we might miss. But in the end, it's up to us to decide what to believe consider all the different perspectives, and come to our own conclusions.
Absolutely. And with that, it's time to come back up from our deep dive into AI bias detection. I hope you found it as interesting and helpful as we have.
It's been great exploring all this with you. Remember, stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep questioning the world around you.
Until next time.